I talked to treating physicians across the board. Same answer, which was, oh, wow, I hate seeing those patients. They're very challenging to take care of. I would love to give them something that's not a Parkinson's drug. Every single patient I talked to said, oh my gosh, I can't fall asleep because my legs go crazy. I would do anything to treat this. Can you trick your brain into thinking that your feet are moving, but they're not actually moving?
Imagine you're in bed at night, finally drifting off to sleep when this sensation starts to build up in your legs. It's an intense restlessness that makes it unbearable to hold still, like an itch that you just can't scratch. Patients describe it as being like Coca-Cola flowing through your veins. And the only thing that helps is getting up and moving around. But of course, moving is the one thing that you can't do if you're trying to go to sleep. That's what life is like if you're living with a condition called Restless Leg Syndrome. 25 million Americans have it, and until recently, the best that medicine could offer was a handful of Parkinson's drugs, with side effects so bad that 3 of those 4 drugs have already been pulled from standard of care guidelines for restless leg syndrome. Enter Shri Raghunathan. Shri is the CEO and co-founder of Noctrix Health, and his device, Nidra, does something deceptively simple. It tricks your brain into thinking that your legs are moving when they're not. And for patients who experience it, the difference is literally night and day. Where does music for you fit into so much of the work that inspires you?
You know, that's an interesting one. So I think I've said the story to a few people before. I think way back when I was in college in back in India, and I was passionate about music. Used to play in a band, and just do all the regular things college kids did. But I really wanted to get into sound engineering and audio engineering and just study that more. And I actually picked up a book called This Is Your Brain on Music by Oliver Sacks and Phantoms in the Brain by V.S. Ramachandran. And it completely gave me a whole new perspective of, neurons, digital on-off circuits. But more than anything else, how can your brain tell that there's a note that's not in scale? Or like there's something that's off key, even if you've never heard that song before, even if that song is in a foreign language that is completely the first time you're ever listening to it. So it got me really intrigued by that question. I went down a rabbit hole. And then as I started applying into graduate school, I wanted to focus my training in electrical engineering and, focus more on the neuroscience side of things. And say, look, how does the brain interpret things? The neurons were digital circuits in my mind, just on and off, just like transistors. So I was like, well, how difficult can that be? It's the same thing as digital circuit design. And boy, was I wrong. So I got my PhD doing, neural engineering stuff in biomedical engineering. I was still designing circuits. I was still kind of focused on my hardcore strengths, but just the applications changed. The applications were towards, back then I was studying epilepsy and studying how, the brain, how could you detect seizures and how could you potentially intervene and interrupt a seizure? Back then it was local field potential recording with implanted depth electrodes. So circuits that were more optimized to do that. So that got me down this path of very, very impactful work, I would say, is that it's still engineering at its core. It's signal processing, it's circuit design, but the end application was just so impactful and so powerful that almost wound up becoming like a drug. Is like, hey, this is what I want to do for the rest of my career. Focus on applications that genuinely make people's life better, or like scale what, a single EE or a single engineer somewhere can do into like the hands of thousands, tens of thousands, if not millions of patients worldwide. So to this day, I will say, that I've got those few books to thank that got me down this path. And to this day, music has sort of been my go-to for whether that's unwinding, de-stressing, or, fondly reminiscing on a past.
That's so interesting how you put it, that we are innately able to sort of recognize a single note that's amiss, even if it's a different culture's musical style that we haven't heard before. And that's really fascinating.
Turns out there's a whole world-class team at Purdue that studies this in tremendous detail. And I went to Purdue. It's called the Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences division, where all they do is, study how the brain processes speech and language, and, certain languages like Cantonese, or, the intonations are already built in and they have better pitch perception than languages where intonation may not be part of the language pattern. So I signed up as a volunteer for many of these studies, and they had many of these, the PhD students that were doing work with EEG electrodes placed all around my cortex. So incredibly fascinating work. It remains intriguing to this day.
Something really interesting about your background before building Noctrix was this pattern of working in spaces that have a device that could be leveraged for patients, but also medicines that often come before. And you've spoken publicly about the frustration of having to pass through one gate to get to the next. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think the first time I got to experience this firsthand was during my stint at a company called Cyberonics. I mean, we used to make vagus nerve stimulators for patients that had intractable epilepsy. Essentially, once you fail all known epilepsy medications, you get referred to get a VNS implant put in. And the implant was pretty successful. The best outcomes were, almost a couple of years, 2, 3, 4 years post-implant. But the bigger challenge really was who was getting that device was usually somebody who was at their end of their rope. So pretty much exhausted every single option out there. And as I'm sure you know, seizures have a pretty irreversible effect on brain tissue, especially having multiple seizures that are generalized motor seizures every single day for years. That just has a physical effect on brain tissue, but also the psychological impact of having to live with that for decades before potentially finding relief was just incredibly gut-wrenching to see. I mean, again, the risk of having an invasive implantable device always would need to be considered as it, pertained to some of the other standard of care or treatment options that existed for neurologists. Medical devices have always been considered sort of the last resort. And historically, that's because medical devices have been physical, mechanical contraptions, right? Like stents that open a valve, open a artery. There's a mechanical valve, there's a suture. Medical devices were always devices that you put inside your body. I think that's completely changed with some of the wave of medical devices that are commercial today, have been now for, I would say, the last decade. Neurostimulation is one example. I thought particularly intriguing about this modality of action was that it was mechanistic. It was not mechanical. So you're finding a particular mechanism in the body and you're altering that in a very focused, non-systemic way to minimize those systemic adverse events and help the body fix whatever symptom it is that you're tracking. So to me, that was a light bulb moment of saying like, hey, this is very mechanistic in nature. And yes, it does have risks associated with invasive implanted medical devices, infection, lead migration, all of those. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could evolve medical devices to a space where truly it finds a spot in the care continuum ahead of some of these last resorts, right? So when you go see your doctor for, say, I don't know, chronic migraine, and the physician says, hey, David, you could take these 3 drugs for the rest of your life, or you could wear this watch. And I always say, all things being equal, there's a huge, tremendous patient preference to say, I'd love to wear this watch if it treated my migraine. And that's a big if, right? So again, that means that it's up to us to build that body of evidence to truly go toe-to-toe with pharma, right? And say, hey, here's all the RCT data. Here's well-controlled, well-designed clinical trials. Here's a body of evidence published in reputable peer-to-peer reviewed journals. And here's standard of care guidelines that support the use of this therapy. So to me, that's the mountain, the body of work that I think medical devices need to take on, and not necessarily find the shortest path to get a 510K or find a substantially equivalent device and try to find the shortest path to commercial isn't always the most beneficial long term. So to me, that long-term mission is very impactful. of being able to say, hey, we've truly brought a medical device to the call point of a specialist. In the case of Noctrix, that opportunity presented itself really, really well because Restless Leg Syndrome, or RLS, is managed by sleep specialists, right? Sleep specialists don't put devices inside bodies. They refer if they need to do that, but they see a ton of patients with RLS. And if they had an option to treat those patients with a device instead of giving them a drug, then this could be a wonderful chance for devices to now compete at a call point that, historically has been reserved for pharmaceutical agents. And we feel like we can win that battle 7 days out of 7 and twice on Sunday with the adverse event profile and the benefits that you could get with, say, a non-invasive medical device, right? So now you're even removing the only barrier there is, which is surgical risk and implantation. Could you do that with a minimally or a non-invasive medical intervention? Then, you've completely changed the calculus at this call point. So to me, that mission over and beyond what we do today at Noctrix was incredibly compelling. I mean, I firsthand saw this with my experience with epilepsy, and I wish there were a way we could intervene earlier in these patients' lives and say, hey, maybe when you failed your second anti-epileptic med, we could have intervened with a device that potentially would, slow down this path. But again, how do we do that? How do we present evidence? How do we get historically drug-biased call points to get educated about mechanisms of action that are not pharmaceutical, right? A neurologist historically does not go to school and train on mechanisms outside of biopharma, what biopharma sells, right? So they know how to prescribe the right drug, and they do a wonderful job of that. And I think this is a whole new paradigm shift in how can we bring, a non-pharmaceutical intervention in. And sleep lends itself wonderfully to do that, because if you look at 3/4 of what a sleep physician does today is prescribe CPAP, which is a non-invasive device that has excellent success rates at treating sleep apnea. Now, compliance is a whole different thing. Do people want to use it is a whole different thing. But when used as directed, it's very effective in treating sleep apnea. And sleep apnea is one particular condition where perhaps you may say, hey, that only happens because there's no drugs for sleep apnea. If you had a pill that could treat sleep apnea, which is happening too, that may change the market dynamics. But at least as a call point, we found that sleep was more open to saying, hey, devices could have a perfectly legitimate spot in the care continuum here, and they don't frown upon that.
This seems like a perfect time to take a half step back and talk about when you discovered restless leg syndrome as what would be your next need to focus on. Or I use discover maybe a little bit liberally, but tell me about the experience of coming across restless leg syndrome. What did you see that sparked a real fire to solve this need? And tell me about that.
So as part of Stanford Biodesign, my particular fellowship year was unique in that we had an externship in the middle of the year. For those of you that aren't familiar listening, externships in biodesign, or you typically go out and spend some time in industry, or you work in venture. You get to do something outside of Stanford, and you come back, bring those skill sets to bear into the rest of the fellowship year. Our fellowship year was unique in that we had an option to do that again towards the tail end of the program.
Oh, wow.
So rather than go back and, do an industry rotation or work within venture, as an engineer, for me, the scarce commodity was access to the clinic and access to being able to see things firsthand. So I chose to kind of go back in and just observe. I mean, it was the end of the program. We couldn't really do much more at that point. We're coming up on the end of the year. But if nothing, I just wanted to go in and, start observing more in the sleep clinic, having digested what I'd learned over the past year on how to take that observation, convert it into a need statement and filter and all that good stuff. And I was chasing an angle on sleep and sleep apnea. It was very compelling to me to be in a space like sleep, just because everybody has the problem. It's very relatable. Everybody likes to talk about it. There's no stigma about talking about good or bad sleep. right? They'll just chew your ears off about saying, oh, I only got 2 hours of sleep, or I've been on jet lag. Patients are very open about discussing what is wrong or not wrong with their sleep. And sleep apnea is like tremendously prevalent and undiagnosed, underdiagnosed, all of it. What I saw, which was, again, perhaps not surprising to a lot of your viewership or to you, is that there's a lot of denial in sleep apnea, in that patients coming in would often, when they would come in for an overnight sleep study, they would say, well, I don't really have anything. My wife wants me to go get strapped in and do this thing. I'm just snoring and she doesn't like it. There was a general denial of like, I don't have it. There's nothing. I just snore. I need to lose a few pounds. And then even when they got diagnosed with sleep apnea and got prescribed a CPAP, I mean, translated to really poor compliance. It was just, I don't want to use it. I'm not going to use it 4, 5, 6 hours a night. And physicians were frustrated too, because there's only so much you could do to push a patient to say, hey, you're going to have to use this. And incidentally, when I was talking to some of these patients, I saw that some of them were getting diagnosed with this condition called Restless Leg Syndrome. And that was new. And I'd worked in neurology for about a decade before this. And I'd never heard of something called RLS. And so I started digging in. I started pulling on that thread more. And I said, what is this? Why did this person get diagnosed with RLS or have an incident finding of RLS in that sleep report? That's really what blew me away. Was unanimously every single patient I talked to said, oh my gosh, I would do anything to treat this. This is a huge issue for me. Like, this is what I came into the doctor for, not this sleep screening, sleep apnea thing. I can't fall asleep because my legs go crazy. And then I was like, oh, this is interesting. I've rarely seen that level of patient acceptance of the problem and saying, I do have a thing that I need to get help for. And so I flipped that script around and talked to treating physicians. I talked to pulmonologists, neurologists, internists. Typically, those are the 3 that we commonly see with a fellowship in sleep that are sleep practitioners. Across the board, same answer, which was, oh, wow, I hate seeing those patients. They're very challenging to take care of. I would love to give them something that's not a Parkinson's drug. I give them this drug because this is the only thing available. It's got a terrible side effect profile. We know it. It works so-so. But these patients are tough. And I would love to treat them with something else. So to me, it was like, ding, 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 wait a minute. The push and the pull existed in the market. And it wasn't like we just got lucky and talked to 4 physicians who were very passionate about it. I started going out of the Stanford circle, talking to other physicians, friends, network, reached out. Across the board, it was the same thing. And then I started spending some time on social media, looking at Reddit, Facebook. Huge perception of the patient problem, very engaged community of patients that are all supporting each other. And then when you flip the page to, well, what exists? Crickets. There was nothing. So that faced me with one of 2 paths. Is like, this is either such a big scientific breakthrough that needs to happen to understand the disease, and it's relatively new and we can't help. Or 2, it's just, hiding in plain sight. And I firmly think it's, there's a bit of both, but there's definitely answers that are hidden in plain sight. So that's what got me really intrigued to say, hey, wait a minute. There's a huge underserved patient population. It's tremendously debilitating to their quality of life. Both physicians and patients widely understand that something needs to be done, and yet there's nothing. So really, it only remained one last puzzle piece that remained was, well, you got to solve it, right? So, and that's really what, to me, that was the essence of Stanford Biodesign, right? So the solving part, we always say, like, you bring in enough engineers and with caffeine and beer, they're gonna solve something, right? But it's, what's the problem to solve? How do you know you're done? What are the measures that make sense to know that you're tracking towards a solution? So that's what, unfortunately, I was out of the fellowship by then, and it was a brief kind of an immersion period. I took that back with me, and having gone through a full year of training at Stanford, I continued to noodle on that, of like, hey, what might we do to address this unmet need? And frankly, what I was trying to do is kill it. Much like any other need statement or stuff that came up, the focus was, this can't be true. Like, there's got to be a reason. There's a gotcha here. Let's go find that. And I was constantly chasing that. And even a year after Biodesign, I wouldn't say I cracked the solution, but I couldn't find a way to kill it because it was just that big, and it was incredibly compelling. So I think that's kind of what got me started into with the Noctrix story.
You use the phrase, or you said patients tell you that they try to go to sleep and their legs go crazy. Tell me a little bit more about what you heard from patients, because I think to the lay public who's never had restless legs and maybe who hasn't heard of it, they may not have the same visceral sense hearing that word that I think you and I hear. Like, what is the lived experience of these patients who are desperate for treatment?
Frankly, that was the part that blew me away too. When I first heard of RLS in the incidental diagnosis, I just thought it was benign. I was like, oh, okay, well, is that when you get nervous and shake your feet under a table maybe? And boy, was I wrong. I mean, that was completely blew my mind to know that, wow, this is so different from what the name sounds like. Talking to patients, I've heard different explanations that patients use to describe what happens during their symptoms. Sometimes I hear it's like Coca-Cola flowing through your veins in the leg. It's very hard to describe. It's like an urge that I got to get up and move. We had one of our early users of the Nidra product who recently showed up at our national sales meeting and talked about his experience being on Nidra, but more importantly, his lived experience with RLS. And he described it as the beast. He's like, hey, it's this beast. It's like this energy that shows up in my legs, and I don't know how to describe it other than like I'm compelled to move. It's not an involuntary movement. It's almost like another patient described it wonderfully to me. It's like, imagine you're falling asleep and you're just about to doze off and someone's kind of poking you on the hip. And you're like, hey, don't do that. That's not fun. And then that happens all night long and you're not able to fall asleep. It's that irritation, unable to fall asleep because that urge builds up so much. The only way to relieve that urge is to get up and walk or kick their feet or rub their legs, do a dorsiflexion of the foot. And different patients cope with it in different ways, but unanimously what they would say is it's this uncontrollable urge that sort of takes over them. And unfortunately, since this is slightly more prevalent in women than men, there's also a lot of stigma associated with you're just menopausal, you're crazy, this is all in your head. So for years it was dismissed as a psychiatric condition. Like, how can this be true? To this day, I read out this email to the team. One of the physicians I started working with, who used to teach the RLS program at Stanford, who still does, wonderful, wonderful person, incredible insights from decades of helping millions of patients directly and indirectly. He actually forwarded an email that somebody sent to him asking to come see his practice. And this lady was saying, look, I've lived with RLS all my life. And when I lost it was when my husband dragged me, put me in the car, took me to the ER, to the psych ward, and said, this is in your head. You got to get this out. And that's when I couldn't do this anymore. I want to come see you, but your front office tells me you don't have appointments for the next 12 months. I'm not going to make it the next 12 months. I'm not going to be here for that. And I need you to help me, and I need you to help me sooner than 12 months. And that story is not unique. Just day before yesterday, we got a request from the European RLS patient advocacy group, the European RLS Foundation, I believe it's called, with an actual patient who's a lady who's 70 years old or 72 years old, who's lived with RLS all her life. She's seen some of the best doctors, including the best doctor in Netherlands. And there's nothing. There's nothing for her. She's tried everything. And now she's applied under the assisted suicide program in Netherlands, and they've just approved it.
Oh my gosh.
She is making this request through the European Foundation to us to say, hey, I can't wait for more years because I can't live with this. And I've got my petition for compassionate or assisted suicide approved, and I'm gonna say yes to it because I can't wait for however long it's going to take for Europe to have another therapeutic option to treat RLS. Again, that story is it's a compelling reminder to everybody in the company. We read these things out. We make sure that everybody knows why they're doing what they're doing. The patient impact is so tremendous. And, we'd like to think that this treatment is the answer to depression, anxiety, blah, blah, blah. But really, it's just good sleep. If they're not sleeping, if they haven't slept more than 2 hours in weeks, months, years, it's incredible to see what good sleep will do to you. And I think that's what they're struggling with is how can they find a shot at sleeping 4, 5, 6 hours and getting a semblance of who they used to be back. And that quality of life impact is, again, no different than having, say, severe sleep apnea and then completely getting your AHI under control. So now you feel rested. You've actually got a full night's sleep. It's not just about treating the night. It's about the day, right? Like how your day goes if you actually get a full night's rest. And for me, with RLS, it was also the dread, right? I was all too familiar with that, with my experience in epilepsy. In talking to patients with severe epilepsy, they would say, it's not even the seizures. I've made my peace with the seizures. It's not knowing when I'm going to get my next seizure and where am I going to be when I have that seizure. I can't have a productive, functioning, normal life if at any point in time I'm going to be on the floor. That is exactly the same with RLS, except it's not uncertainty. They know it's coming every single evening, every single night. So you dread that aspect of your life and you're like, oh my gosh, this is going to be tough. And we've actually had patients who've written to us and said, hey, I haven't been able to go see my grandkids because I needed to hop on a flight from Florida to New York. And I can't do that flight with my RLS. It's just impossible for me to sit. But now wearing this device, I actually flew to New York and I was able to see my grandkids and hold them for the first time. Those are the aspects that you just, as engineers and scientists and physicians, we see so much of this that sometimes we tend to tune out, and you focus on that patient experience, that lived experience. It makes you that much more passionate about what you bring to your 9 to 5 every single day.
Shri, I think the audience that heard this story has got to be wondering what happened with this person from Europe who wrote in. Were you able to get them a device or?
This is late break. This is as of Friday. So, so we're literally like 2 days in.
Wow.
I mean, the reality is, we do not have the regulatory approvals necessary to service any other market outside of the US market. So we are certainly exploring what we could potentially do.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, while we're talking about the device, you had this kind of really beautiful insight about what is going on with the brain when you give into those cravings of getting up and moving your legs. I would love if you could share what that was and how that hunch turned into something that you tested out and became your device.
Once I kind of saw the push and the pull, that unmet need, we started digging more into what is RLS? How do you diagnose it? And, as an engineer, for me, if it's not an objective, measurable diagnosis, it's always hard. It's like, well, I don't know if that person have it or not. It seems very subjective. RLS is one condition where I think I've been proven wrong in spades, because they have this thing called the urge criteria, which is, do you have an urge to move your legs? Is it provoked by rest or when you're relaxing, the R? Does it actually get better when you move your legs? That's the G. And then does it get worse in the evenings and nights? That's the E. The hallmark of RLS across almost any RLS patient will tell you this is the G, which is it actually gets better when you move your legs. So motion, movement, proprioception appears to, albeit temporarily, fix the problem, right? So you get up and walk. In fact, we've had a patient say they have an exercise bike right next to their bed. They jump on the bike, they go crazy on the bike and hop back into bed and hope they can fall asleep. So something about movement, and I equated it to being akin to kind of scratching an itch, right? So you have an itch, the urge kind of builds up. Pretend you can't scratch the itch. And if you just kind of scratched it, it'll go away. But that's kind of what movement was in my sort of naive interpretation of what was happening there. Now, there's a peripheral mechanism for that interacts with the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So the simple hypothesis that I took into this was, can you trick your brain into thinking that your feet are moving, but they're not actually moving? So in other words, the motion solves the problem, but it's not compatible with sleep. So you can't get up and shake your feet. Or in fact, there was a device that vibrated your feet. And oftentimes it would make the problem worse because motion isn't going to be conducive to sleep. So how do you then tell your spinal cord and your CNS that your muscles are engaged and there's movement, but it's not actually physically moving your feet? So many approaches that were hypotheses at that point. So we used, back from the VR world, I looked up what people in the VR world used to vibrate tendons at specific frequencies that would cause you to think you're tilting or moving. You were on these gaming headsets and they would vibrate a tendon behind your ear, so it'll make you feel like your car's banking, even though it's not. So it turns out you can do that with your leg too. The Achilles tendon, you can vibrate it at a certain frequency and it feels like you're dorsiflexing your foot. Sure, it did feel like it was moving my feet, but unfortunately can't sleep with that. It's in many ways it was the same challenge. So one thing led to another. I looked at, ultrasound, I looked at the vibration, some infrared research that had been done, compression research that had been done to look at, is this a circulatory issue? And ultimately went back to neurostimulation. Seemed like it was a promising approach. I guess it's a well-known reflex called the Hoffman's reflex or the H reflex, is you stimulate the peroneal nerve afferently and you get an efferent response back. We know we're stimulating the peroneal nerve. So what we tried to do was, hey, can we stimulate the nerves on your legs that tell your spinal cord and hence your CNS that your anterior tibialis or your lower leg muscles are engaged, and they're not actually engaged. They're not actually moving. You're not firing motor neurons in them. What it did do was produce a sustained increase in muscle tone in that muscle. And that was the equivalent of you sort of dorsiflexing your foot up, and that muscle tone starts holding. We saw the same thing in EMG. When we stimulated the afferent fibers of the peroneal nerve, the efferent response was an increase in tonic signal on the surface EMG of that muscle. And that's how you know you're activating that reflex. So now the big question was, that was way more tolerable because it was at a much, much higher frequency than muscle stimulation or EMS or TENS. It was much more tolerable to dump a lot of charge into the nerve to trigger that and produce that tonic signal. And so we sent patients back home with, various contraptions and gadgets to see if that was sleep compatible, and that would take care of their RLS. So that's what got this whole TOMAC thing started. So we called it tonic motor activation therapy because it was essentially activating tonic in that muscle, so tonic muscle activation. And that's what wound up being at the core of what is in the product today, which goes by the brand name Nidra.
Wow. I'll backtrack. You ran the Restful trial, 130 plus patients, sham controlled, all of your endpoints met. When did you first have the sense that this was going to work?
Actually, well before that. So another thing that lent itself beautifully to innovating in this space in RLS was there was an assay that was an acute provocative test to provoke symptoms of RLS. It's called the Suggested Immobilization Test, or SIT. It's a torture test for anybody that has RLS, unfortunately. You'd bring in a patient, have them sit on a bed with their legs stretched out, usually evenings or nights when their symptoms presented. And sure enough, their symptoms would show up. And then you could actually intervene and see if pretty much
having
just
to hold
sitting there.
still. Wow.
That's it. Hold still. And then we would measure how many times they'd have to get up and walk or kick their legs and have leg movement sensors on. So it's within 60 minutes, you could literally see how uncomfortable their symptoms got. And for me, I came from the implantable devices world, right? So implantable devices have this wonderful advantage. It's called implant and forget. Compliance is 100%. Right? Once it's in your body, it's doing its thing. You don't have to do anything. Not the same for non-invasive or wearable devices, or pharma for that matter, drugs. Compliance is a big deal. I firmly believe that people are only going to do something regularly if there's instant gratification. Now, those that are very strong-willed and have different hacks to, you know, do habit formation, maybe there are solutions, but generally, even in the consumer electronics world, I think we failed miserably in getting people to be compliant or do something past, say, January. You get a new Fitbit, get a new Apple Watch, and like by February, that's gone. It's sitting in the shelf gathering dust. The SIT was my assay that I could use to show if you could turn on this device and instantly control symptoms. By instantly meaning in the magnitude of minutes to hours, not weeks to days. And that's when we first started seeing like, wow, this is incredible to see this. Like we would turn on certain stimulation settings. We were also trying to identify what nerve targets to go for. Was it the pudendal, the femoral, the tibial? So the test itself lent itself well to being able to experiment. And when we did find the peroneal and found those stimulation settings, it was almost like magic. I mean, it wouldn't be down to zero. It's not curative, but almost instantly patients would be like, oh, wow, this feels great. This feels like, so then it became a question of like, how do we make this sleep compatible? Right? Like, how do we make it to where you don't even feel the stimulation as much? Right. So then you could blind it better. You could do all of those things that lend itself well to running a clinical trial. But that was the first time that there was a good solid hunch that, hey, there's something here. But again, the N size is very small. It was 10 to 15 patients. It worked repeatedly on those 10 to 15 patients, but it was still such a small pocket of patients to try this on. We didn't even know if there were different phenotypes of RLS, and maybe we just got lucky. We just studied one. But it was promising, to say the least. So it was enough for us to say, hey, we're going to put together a small round of funding around this company. We've got some early data. The technology isn't really rocket science. We could build this. The big questions remained is, hey, is this going to be sleep compatible? Could you do this at home? What outcomes are you going to even try to measure? So that's what we studied before that 140 patient pivotal trial. We studied that in-home, double-blinded RCT, just like the pivotal. And we tried a few things and we measured a few different outcomes. And again, good news about this space was there are 4 FDA-approved drugs in this space. And my vision was always to say, hey, you're going to go toe-to-toe with them. There's no difference here. So let's look at what they did for their FDA studies. So we looked at their FDA studies, what endpoints had they used, and educated the FDA on. And we went after the exact same ones. Now, fast forward to when we ran our trials, we found some of those endpoints were not the most sensitive. Fortunately, we were still making a big effect on all of those endpoints to where we were able to meet all the endpoints and get the device approved. But we feel like the true effectiveness of the device is not even captured by the magnitude of drops in some of those scores that we use that pharma had previously used. But again, we chose to pick our battles and say, hey, what do we want to go and do? We don't want to educate the FDA on a whole new set of outcomes that we believe should be used in this space. Instead, we chose to say, we're going to do what Requip, Mirapex, and Horizon have done. And we'll show you outcomes on the same exact scales. And we'll show you in a sham-controlled study that the therapy is effective. And of course, when it came to safety, it was night and day. Right? So we didn't have any of the serious adverse events. We did not have, tumor formations. We did not have addictive behavioral patterns developing. So we knew we had that advantage going in, but we also wanted to make sure on the efficacy standpoint that we could go toe-to-toe with some of these drugs.
Shri, it's incredible to hear you lay out one of your challenges being that the existing standards didn't have strong enough endpoints for you to prove quite how effective your solution was. That's not something you hear often.
Yeah, I mean, it's because the existing standards were written for drugs, right? So I think,
yeah.
And if you think about why a scale exists, It's because someone tried to study the problem and solve it and said, hey, here's how I know I'm solving the problem. Now I'm going to write a scale that kind of captures that, right, and gets that validated. So that's kind of how science evolves. And as you learn more and you have more data, I think you start incorporating that more. I mean, I'll give you a classic example, right? So in that scale, there is a question that says, in the last week, how many nights did you have RLS symptoms, right? So patients would say, well, I'm 7 out of 7. And then say 2-3 weeks later, they're saying, yeah, 6 out of 7. But they're saying they're doing great. They don't want to give the device back. And so it's a head scratcher to me. It's like, oh, wait a second. You still have symptoms 6 out of 7 nights. Why are you not giving the device back? It's like, oh, the symptoms show up. I put the device on and it goes away. Right. So it's even nuances like that, right?
Wow.
That
Wow.
get you all tripped up in how do you study that? How do you capture that?
Yeah.
Um, kudos to my co-founder and the clinical team that he assembled was incredible at really going and running these very high leverage A/B experiments, and then working with some of our thought leader KOL physicians, some of whom had incidentally been involved in developing those scales before. So they were able to give us the history behind, oh, here's why this exists. Right. And that's the wonderful thing about this RLS community as well. They're all so open, they're engaging and helping patients. They do want to do something. They haven't seen anything in this space for decades. And they're very generously opening up their time and talking to us at this point, like, nobodies who are just noodling on a project with a startup. So it was great to kind of have those conversations early and often and understand if those outcomes were the ones we would still use for our pivotal trials, or were there better outcomes to use, and then weigh that against the trade-off of educating, say, the agency and all the regulatory bodies. But it's not just the agency and regulatory bodies. Keep in mind, all of clinical practice uses this scale as well, right? So you're now going in and doing all of that work. So those are real trade-offs that most startups have to face and think through, like, hey, pick your battles. What do you want to go optimize today? Right. So what we chose to do is like, hey, we've got a number of other battles ahead of us. Let's use the outcomes that exist. I think we're going to show efficacy on those as they stand. And then as we continue to build evidence and we continue to, take market share away from standard of care treatments today, there's an opportunity to start opening up our data set and saying, hey, maybe there are other measures that could be interesting to look at.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I'm so curious. You are sitting on a technology that has been just absolutely life-changing for these patients, and you're already commercializing. When you start to think of the horizon and think of the future even beyond the horizon, what do you see for Nidra, for Noctrix? What do you hope the future looks like?
It's we often get asked this question of like, hey, this sounds too good to be true. Like, there's a device that it works, it helps patients tremendously. It's got none of the systemic adverse events. And look, the reality is nothing ever works for everybody and everything and all the time. So, but within reason, we've got very compelling clinical evidence. It then comes down to the 800-pound gorilla in the room: is how are you going to get this paid for? And who pays for it? That's the eight-headed monster that is our healthcare system in the United States, right? Figuring out, is this a reimbursed medical device? Is this a cash pay? Is this a CPT code? Is it a procedure performed by a surgeon or a physician? A lot of time was spent in thinking about that early in the company and starting to think about, like, hey, what's the commercial pathway here? So I would say by far, that North Star for us hasn't changed, which is patient impact. And patient impact is only truly realized by expanding coverage, which is payers agreeing to pay for this therapy and covering it as medically necessary. So I would say definitely, at least over the last year, and moving forward in the next year or two as well, we want to certainly evangelize that message of saying, here's why you should cover Nidra. Here's real world patient data. Here's how you're changing patient lives. And this is why you need to put them on Nidra instead of some of these potent medications. And to support that, I mean, now we've got the American Academy of Sleep Medicine's standard of care guidelines that include Nidra. And not only does it include Nidra, 3 of those 4 FDA-approved drugs I talked about are no longer part of the standard of care. So we've seen a sea shift in the RLS space, moving away from the mainstay of treatment, which is dopamine agonists. And overwhelmingly, the consensus is these dopamine agonists have caused more harm than benefit, and they don't support their inclusion as being part of standard of care. They are still FDA approved to treat RLS. The European RLS groups are moving very quickly to follow suit with the American partners. And we're optimistic that Nidra is going to be included in that recommendation as well, because we're presenting all of the peer-reviewed data, the meta-analyses. Nidra is featured in a JAMA review article as necessary for patients. We're in the up-to-date guidelines, and thousands of patients are using it today, every single day, and having gotten the necessary approvals and coverage from their insurance. So I would say what I'm excited for, looking forward, is 1 in 10 adults has RLS. It's 25 million Americans have RLS. About a third of them have RLS that is severe enough that they're on medications. But think about the populations all over the world. The Western European and European prevalence is just about as high as the US. The Asian prevalence of RLS is heavily underdiagnosed, but that's still 1 to 2% of the Asian population has RLS. Those are exciting opportunities for me to see, how can we take what used to be a little idea where we were vibrating tendons to today it's standard of care therapy. So no matter what happens, you forever change standard of care of RLS, because now there's high frequency bilateral peroneal nerve stimulation, or TOMAC, included as part of standard of care guidelines. How could you now make this available to all patients worldwide as an option? So that is something that gets me incredibly excited to start thinking about, especially for these patients that I just cited from Europe. It's incredibly painful to hear these stories of what could we do? I mean, there's regulatory constraints, there's legal constraints, there's clinical trials that you need to run, there's import-export laws governing the use of medical devices. The single best thing that we can do as entrepreneurs, innovators, clinicians is do the best that we possibly can in our jobs. Whether that's getting a CE mark, whether that's expediting approvals, whether that's fundraising and finding your investors to take the company to the next stage. All of that needs to be in service of one mission, which is how do we get this in the hands, in my case, in the legs of thousands and thousands and millions of patients, right? So that even this past month, we sort of previewed an initiative within the company where we said 10 million nights. So every single thing we do in the company, every project, every engineering initiative, we try to quantify that and say, how many more nights does that add? How quickly does it get us to 10 million nights? So every patient we onboard, every night that they're using it, the real-time ticker goes up and says, hey, that's 1 more night, that's 1 more night. So we want to accelerate to 10 million nights of relief and say, hey, we've provided the option for 10 million nights of relief for patients. So that helps us internally kind of prioritize projects and programs. And it also gives every single person in the company a direct, tangible connection to that purpose and say, hey, I'm boxing kits and shipping it out. Should I pick 2-day or overnight? And you know how to decide now. Hey, what's my mission? What's my goal? What does the company want me to prioritize? I need to accelerate to get to 10 million nights of relief. Should I do this? Yes. Here's why you do it. So I think that's been very, very exciting, and it's given us all collectively. I sit here taking credit for, a team of 120, 130 people now that are working on this tirelessly. It's immensely gratifying to see that. So to scale that is going to be sort of what gets me out of bed and excited next.
Wow. Shri, for people who listen to this conversation and are inspired, as I am just talking to you, folks who haven't started building anything yet, who are maybe still looking for their idea, what advice do you give to someone that says, I really want to make something, but I don't know what? Where do you tell them to start and figure that out?
I mean, this is where Stanford Biodesign was a blessing for me, because I was that person. I said, hey, I want to do something. I don't know what. What do I do? So at that point, my answer was, well, let me go learn more about it. I don't know what to do, but I know that's more purposeful, and I would feel more satisfied doing that. So that's kind of what got me into neuroscience to begin with. But I think biodesign does a wonderful job. Stanford Biodesign does a wonderful job of saying, focus on the unmet need. Right? Don't worry about how you're going to solve it or what is it that your widget does or your solution or your intervention does, and anchor yourself very, very deeply on what is the problem you're trying to solve. If you've spent the time truly understanding that problem, knowing when you're done, I think the method, the solutions kind of become oblivious, and sort of you're agnostic to whether it's a drug, a device, a pill, or a surgery. You're so passionate about solving that problem. The caveat here is make sure you pick a problem that is real and big enough and can support it, right? That's what biodesign does a wonderful job of kind of helping you quantify, right? Like maybe it's only a problem in 3 people and you happen to see 2 of them. So being very objective during that process was very helpful. So I will say for those that are similarly inclined as what I just described, is before you sort of get obsessed or fall in love with a thing you've invented and you're trying to figure out where that invention is applicable, I would flip that on its head and say, you're very passionate about, let's say, helping people, and you see this is a huge problem, blank being, I don't know, just maybe obesity, patients struggling with weight loss or whatever. Study that religiously rather than, hey, I've got this invention and I want to figure out where this invention fits. I still have healthy debates with my friends who are in tech that build tech, right? That's what they do. They don't focus on, they always point out the example of like, hey, when the iPhone came out, there was no app store. Apps were built later, but until I built the iPhone, there were no apps, and then you don't know what you use the iPhone for. And there's a universe where that applies, and I like to think of that as sort of the universe of wants, where you want something, and that's purely optional, right? Like you could choose to not have it. But in healthcare, we operate in the spectrum of needs, right? Like nobody wants a pacemaker. You need a pacemaker. So if you're trying to solve something that's a need, you almost certainly cannot start with, hey, I've got an iPhone. Once I build it, they will come. It needs to be more of, this is the problem, and how do I solve this problem? And then the solution of whether it's an iPhone becomes agnostic. And it never resonated more than, even in my, at this point, hundreds of conversations with patients. One of them said, I put a bar of soap under my pillow, and I heard that helps with RLS. And this lady was a scientist, right? So I was asking her, so what do you think would happen? Or like, why'd you do that? And she said, well, I know it sounds ridiculous, but hey, if it worked, why not? I'm willing to try it, right? So that's how agnostic they become of a solution when the need is compelling. Right. So I think that's what I would encourage people to do is like, if you truly have found a deserving unmet need that is so big, you're agnostic of the solution. And over time, as you have to do these, undeniable pivots, you tried something that didn't work, you tried something else that didn't work. The one thing that doesn't change during that whole process is the need and that unmet need. So if you don't have that, it's going to be very challenging to navigate the ups and downs of a startup, because there are ups, there are downs, lots of downs. So I think that's what I would say, is that anchor yourself heavily on the problem you're solving and don't worry so much about how you're solving it. At least not yet.
Shri, this has been such a joy to get to talk to you and hear about this story.
Likewise, what a pleasure. It's wonderful to be able to get a chance to share the story and hopefully inspire a few of your audience members to say, hey, I need to go solve RLS too. I think more solutions in this space always helps everybody.